They thought the world was asleep. They believed the public would never see the profit machines that worked silently behind every crisis, every upheaval, every surprise hidden behind a veneer of polished language. But then a small crack appeared, and from there, the whole veil of secrecy began to crumble. Amid the chaos of global markets, where invisible forces manipulated the fates of nations like chess pieces, a smoldering truth began to emerge: war was not just a tragedy, it was a carefully designed business model. And as that truth emerged, those behind it began to panic. For the first time, people and nations were realizing what they had never been allowed to know: every economic shock was orchestrated, and the ultimate beneficiary was not an enemy beyond their borders, but the forces that thrived on chaos. Warnings about the profit hand behind global instability are no longer speculative. A United Nations report last month found that global military spending hit a record high of more than $2.4 trillion, the biggest increase in 2 decades. Meanwhile, many independent economic organizations recorded that the profits of arms manufacturers increased by an average of 27% in just 1 year, despite the global economic slowdown. But what is more remarkable is that regional conflicts, from the Middle East to the Sahel to Eastern Europe, have created the same trajectory: local economies collapse, and capital flows back to power groups far from the front lines. And from this reality, an unavoidable question arises: who is really making war, and who is profiting from it? The modern world operates like a giant machine, where every geopolitical move creates economic shockwaves that ripple through many layers. But only those at the top of the pyramid can see the whole picture and realize that the bloodiest wars are not fueled by hatred between nations, but by the need to maintain the profits of a very small group that controls the global cycle of chaos. For decades, war has been presented as national security, humanitarian intervention, protection of allies, or regional stability. But when the layers of rhetoric are peeled back, a cold truth emerges: every bullet has a price, every missile has a paymaster, and every conflict is viewed by someone as a profitable investment. If we look closely at the major conflict cycles of the 21st century, we see the same formula repeated: create a crisis or exploit an existing instability. Promote arms sales in the name of helping a partner country defend itself. Increasing geopolitical influence through tight aid packages. Post-war reconstruction is carried out by the corporations involved. A complete cycle, from destruction to reconstruction, all of which generates profits. When a country falls into a crisis, defense budgets soar. When tensions escalate, arms procurement contracts are accelerated. When hostilities break out, defense corporations' stock prices peak. And when the war ends, the process of rebuilding infrastructure, energy, telecommunications, finance, creates a series of new mega contracts worth tens of billions of dollars. So who wins? Not the soldiers who died. Not the civilians who lost their homes. Not the countries that have to bear huge debts after the war. The winners are the interest groups that live on chaos. The corporations that get richer as the world becomes more unstable. The 21st century marks the shift of war from the ground to fields with less bombs but much more effective. Currency war. Energy war. Technology war. Information war. Proxy war. These models create conflicts without firing a shot. Just by imposing embargoes, raising interest rates, manipulating oil prices, or triggering a food crisis, the effects created are equivalent to a traditional war, but the profits are less risky and can be completely hidden. For example, the spike in oil prices during each round of Middle East tensions is not only due to military events, but also due to the intervention of financial groups that continuously speculate on the fear psychology of global markets. As soon as conflicts break out, these groups take profits, leaving behind consequences such as rising fuel prices, widespread inflation, and people around the world paying the price. Similarly, international sanctions are often presented as measures to protect justice. But in reality, they are often just tools to reorganize markets, eliminate competitors, and pave the way for corporations close to international power centers. A country that is heavily sanctioned loses its competitiveness, loses access to the global financial system, and is forced to rely on new financial intermediaries and the old interests behind them. No business model can function effectively without one key tool, the media, which controls perception. Through this system, people only see the surface of events, but never the underground. News stories follow the same pattern. Blame the other side. Create a sense of urgency. Rationalize increased defense spending. Paint the enemy. Legitimate intervention. Few are allowed to ask the most important question: whose economic interests are enhanced by war? While questions are obscured, truths are distorted, and the public is led into a dead-end debate between this side and that side, billion-dollar deals are quietly happening behind the scenes. For decades, weaker nations, particularly developing ones in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, have become geopolitical battlegrounds where superpowers test strategies, pump out weapons, and vie for influence. These countries do not want war, but they have suffered the most. Economic collapse. Students cannot go to school. Healthcare systems are paralyzed. Poverty rates double. A generation loses its future. Meanwhile, military contracts, post-war infrastructure, and valuable resources are being transferred to corporations that have never been on the battlefield. The irony is that these countries are often labeled as unstable, irresponsible, underdeveloped, while the truth is that they are being used as tools to maintain power and profit for others. But times are changing. Information technology, social networks, artificial intelligence, independent media are breaking the information monopoly of old systems. What used to be hidden behind secret meetings and secret agreements is now gradually being exposed. More and more countries are beginning to see the truth. The global economy has been designed to depend on conflict, and if it does not change, the future of humanity will be nothing but a series of wars. From Africa to Latin America, from South Asia to the Middle East, movements for strategic autonomy, neo-decolonialism, anti-intervention, and building independent economic alliances are emerging. This is not just a protest, but a reshaping of the world order, where small countries no longer accept being turned into pawns. So in the end, which path will the world choose? Continue to let the future be led by groups of power that manipulate chaos? Or break the war-profit model to find a new, fairer order? The answer is not only in the hands of leaders. It lies in the awareness of each citizen, who must understand that every conflict has a price in their blood, while the profit belongs to others. And it is when the truth is told. When the director's hand is exposed, when public opinion stands up to demand change, that is when the war model is shaken. Because no war can last forever when the light of truth shines directly on it. For decades, the world seemed to operate according to a predetermined script: the great powers led, the small nations obeyed, the financial center gave orders, the rest of humanity suffered. But then the tide of history began to waver. Countries that had been considered peripheral, underdeveloped, dependent began to realize the truth they had long been denied: chaos does not happen by chance, it is created, maintained, and managed as an asset. And when that truth was revealed, a new era began, the era of the self-governing nation-states. In recent years, many countries in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and South Asia have stood up to reject the traditional model of dependence. They refused to be tied to credit packages, refused to participate in games that did not bring benefits, refused to let their resources become a source of profit for others. In Africa, this was most evident. Countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger have said no to imposition. They no longer accept international financial institutions deciding economic policies, or allowing major powers to set up military bases on their territory and call it security support. A new axis of autonomy is formed, based on three principles. Absolute sovereignty over resources. Second, decolonization. Freedom to plan a development model without imposition. In the eyes of powers that are used to controlling the world, this is unacceptable. Because when one country breaks the cycle of dependence, many other countries will see the way forward and begin to demand the same. Instead of relying on aid, countries are looking to build independent economies with their own resources. The new model they are pursuing is not resources for loans, but building domestic industrial clusters, strategic export controls, collective rather than individual negotiations, and using resources not as raw commodities, but as geopolitical negotiating leverage. Typically, many African countries have begun to cut off exports of uranium, gold, and crude oil in raw form, forcing foreign corporations to renegotiate. When supplies are squeezed, prices rise, and the power imbalance is broken. This is what worries the old power centers. A financially poor but resource-rich country can turn the tide if it knows how to use resources as a strategic weapon. Awareness is the most important premise leading to change. For decades, weak states have been convinced that they are incapable of governing themselves, need outside aid, need intervention for stability. But now a new generation of leaders has emerged. One that no longer accepts outside arrangements. They openly declare to the world, "We do not need anyone to tell us how to manage our resources. We do not need foreign soldiers to protect our own airspace. We do not want war, but we will not allow chaos to be created in the name of peace." The most frightening thing for manipulative powers is not weapons, but new perceptions, because when thinking changes, centuries-old models of control collapse immediately. As many countries refuse to be dependent, they begin to seek each other. A new wave of alliances is emerging based on the following criteria: shared economic interests, shared political autonomy, shared goals of reducing the influence of old international financial institutions, shared desire to build independent payment, trade, and security systems. The old model where one power dictates and the rest obeys is no longer there. Instead, a multi-centered order is gradually taking shape, where each region has its own voice. The rise of autonomous alliances has caused major cracks to appear in the unipolar model, which has dominated since the Cold War. Traditional strong countries are no longer able to impose their will as before. And this is what is causing the current global chaos. Chaos is not because small countries rise up, it is because old powers refuse to lose control. The rise of sovereign states has direct consequences for groups that live on the war destabilization model. Arms contracts are reduced. Military bases are closed. Resource exploitation routes are controlled. International banking restructuring has made financial institutions lose influence. Think tanks and stabilizers have no place to operate. These interest groups see one thing clearly. When the world is sovereign, their profit model collapses. They cannot sell weapons to countries that do not want war. They cannot lend at huge interest rates if that country switches to another payment system. They cannot create humanitarian crises if the media loses its monopoly. And so they begin to react strongly. Sudden crises, destabilization plots, smear campaigns appear with greater frequency. All with one goal: to keep the world in chaos, because only when chaos exists will their profits continue to flow. For the first time in centuries, the global public has access to faster, more diverse, more independent information. Younger generations understand that wars are not caused by civilians. Instability does not arise from nowhere. And crises often serve a very small group in the background. As awareness spreads, the power of the old model weakens. A new order is emerging not from the agreement of superpowers, but from the awakening of humanity. Countries that were once overlooked are now the new centers of world consciousness. Peoples that were once controlled are the flag bearers of the decolonization movement. And those who were once voiceless have begun to rewrite the chapter of their own future. This is a historic turning point. For the first time, small states are not just fighting back, they are reshaping the entire game. The world is entering a period unprecedented in modern history, a confrontation not between states, but between two ideologies, two models of international order, two understandings of the future of humanity. On one side is the chaotic empire, where war, instability, and reconstruction are the source of profit. On the other is a new order, based on the power of self-governing states, where resources are no longer the fuel for conflict, but the foundation for development. This confrontation is no longer secret. It has come into the open. For decades, international power has been maintained through three main pillars. 1. Economic control by debt. Developing countries are forced into a spiral of perpetual debt. The initial concessional loans are replaced by bailouts with conditions. Internal economic policies are controlled by international financial institutions. In return, these countries must sell cheap resources, privatize national assets, open markets in a way that benefits foreign corporations. Debt becomes an invisible shackle. 2. Security control by chaos. The chaotic empire understands that no country can develop if it is constantly unstable. So, instability is maintained in a sophisticated way, creating tribal conflicts, supporting the opposition, providing weapons to many sides, intervening in the name of anti-terrorism. The more unstable, the easier to control. 3. Controlling perceptions through media. International media corporations create stories. Who is responsible, who is the threat? Who is causing instability? And most importantly, they make the public believe that chaos is caused by cultural, political, and ethnic instability, not by the director behind it. Those three pillars form a golden ring that tightens power over weak countries. In recent years, this model has begun to crack from deep within. 1. The rise of independent media. Social networks, independent analysis channels, freelance journalists break the information monopoly. Secret activities, shady deals, unpublicized agreements are gradually exposed. What the great powers fear most is being seen through. 2. Resistance from the once controlled countries. A new axis emerges in Africa, South Asia, Latin America, the Middle East. Countries declare: no more unfavorable military contracts. No more tied loans. No more foreign troops stationed. No more low-cost resources. No more acceptance of the rich foreign corporations, poor local people model. This is not just a change in policy, it is a change in historical thinking. 3. Instability at the center of power. When the world no longer accepts obedience, the chaotic empire begins to falter. Energy markets shift. Strategic resource routes are recontrolled. Many countries switch to different currencies. Military bases are forced to close. This confusion creates a chain reaction. The empire must create more chaos to maintain its position, but the more chaos it creates, the more the world sees through it. That is the fatal contradiction of the old model. In parallel, a new order is taking shape based on three fundamental principles. 1. Resource autonomy. Countries realize a country that does not control its resources can never have true sovereignty. Therefore, they nationalize strategic mineral deposits, control uranium, lithium, oil and gas, bauxite, cobalt, renegotiate long-term mining contracts, require local processing instead of raw exports. This is a direct attack on the centuries-old model of resource embezzlement profits. 2. Technological autonomy. No longer dependent on imported technology, many countries have begun to build their own satellite systems, develop domestic military technology, develop nuclear energy for civilian purposes, master digital technology, fintech, blockchain, AI. This shift has shaken the model of technological dependence. 3. Financial autonomy. Countries are joining together to build their own payment systems outside of the USD, transact in local currencies, buy and sell energy in local currencies or gold, create a common fund to avoid debt collection. This is what the chaotic empire fears most. When countries no longer borrow money from them, they lose their most effective control tool. The current confrontation is not about geography or military, but about world leadership ideology. The chaos empire believes that the world only works when there is a ruler. Small nations must be subordinate. Chaos is necessary to maintain the balance of power. War is the natural tool of politics. The New World believes that order must be based on justice. Resources belong to the nation. Every nation has the right to develop in its own way. Peace is not a tool, but a goal. These are two completely opposite ideas. The greatest war of the century is not on the battlefield, but in the way the world understands itself. The old model is no longer suitable for three reasons. 1. The speed of information dissemination does not allow for concealment of the truth. Conspiracies are no longer secret. 2. The cost of maintaining chaos is increasing. The more you intervene, the more you lose credibility and the more you face resistance. 3. Nations have matured, they are no longer naive as they were a century ago. They understand the rules of the game and have learned to play again. The old model collapsed not because it was defeated, but because the times surpassed it. Not by war, nor by a global treaty, but by a widespread shift in perception. When one nation stands up, another sees hope. When one force declares its independence, another moves. When one unfair contract is cancelled, dozens more are put on the table for renegotiation. It is the domino effect of freedom. A new order is being born not from superpowers but from the voices of the once silent people. The empire of chaos lives on control. The new world lives on cooperation. One side needs war to survive. The other side needs peace to thrive. And history always favors the model that gives the future to the many, not the few. The greatest confrontation of our time has begun, and no one can stop the wheel of history from turning. But history is never a one-sided story. If the forces that manipulate war believe they can shape the world to their liking, they have forgotten an immutable law: when pressure is applied to the limit, the reaction will explode with more force than imagined. And today, those reaction forces are no longer fragmented. They are connecting, spreading, merging into a wave of unprecedented magnitude in the 21st century. Across continents, from African capitals reclaiming economic sovereignty, to South America breaking international debt cycles, to Southeast Asia redesigning its own development model, a common spirit is rising: enough. Enough of being priced out by others. Enough of being on the sidelines of global value chains. Enough of being turned into a battlefield instead of a center of development. No longer just a series of isolated statements, this movement has become an era of structured, ideological, strategic, and economically and technologically based resistance. 1. New sovereignty, not just a flag, but the right to determine one's own destiny. Countries are entering a period where sovereignty is no longer a symbol, but the right to control resources, supply chains, data, and strategic decisions. A series of African countries have nationalized resources, ending decades of unequal mining contracts. In Latin America, a series of governments have announced debt restructuring on an autonomous roadmap, rejecting coercive terms that have made them dependent. In Asia, localized industrial models are accelerating like never before, creating new economic fortresses. All have one thing in common: not wanting to be controlled by forces that destabilize the world. 2. The awakening of nations, from tolerance to proactively exposing manipulators. If before, people were just spectators of an economic geopolitical drama directed from closed conference rooms, now they have become the ones who rewrite the script. Thanks to social networks, open data, and cross-border citizen movements, once inviolable secrets have been exposed. Who benefits from rising oil prices? Who manipulates stocks through regional crises? Who pushes countries into a spiral of recurring debt? The truth no longer belongs to a small group. It has become the common property of billions of people. And when the masses understand that war, chaos, and crisis are not historical inevitabilities but a deliberate product, the power to reclaim justice begins to take shape. 3. In new alliances, nations join forces to break the stranglehold. No longer are countries facing each other against each global power. Once weak nations are joining together to form economic sovereign blocs, non-dollar payment systems, South-South investment funds, old-style anti-resource exploitation alliances, technology pacts independent of Western corporations. What the old powers feared most is coming true. A new order that does not revolve around their profits. 4. The retreat of the shadow war empire. As more countries slip out of control, the crisis-based business model becomes more fragile. Arms corporations' revenues depend on stress. Investment funds benefit from market turmoil. International banks depend on debt and re-indebtedness. But as nations build up their own domestic defenses, create their own industrial value chains, and diversify their trade, chaos is no longer a source of unlimited profits. This makes these powers more desperate and more dangerous than ever. It is at this moment, when the old power begins to weaken, that they will seek to create new crises. But this time, the world will not stand still. 5. The new global spirit: anti-war, anti-manipulation, anti-resource plunder. A new generation is emerging, one born with technology, raised with information, and refusing to accept the fate that the manipulative powers have built for the past 70 years. For them, sovereignty is more than borders. It is the right to live in a world that is not run as an arms market. That spirit is becoming the most powerful engine, driving civil movements, reforms, and policy changes in many countries. 6. And from here, a big question arises, the question that will decide the fate of the century. As old powers try to cling to an order based on war, and new nations rise up to build an order based on development and justice, the world enters a historic crossroads. Who will this century belong to? War manipulators, or nations that dare to wake up and unite? The answer is becoming clearer every day. But the final chapter is still being written by humanity today. The world is at a turning point that no force can erase. The hands that manipulated war, created crisis, and profited from human suffering are no longer completely hidden in the shadows. The light of global awareness, from rising nations to ordinary people, has shone directly on power structures that were once considered untouchable. But history is never changed by anger alone. It is changed when anger turns into will. And today, that will is converging into the strength of nations that dare to say no, of peoples who dare to reclaim their voices, and of a generation that understands that peace is not a gift handed down, but the fruit of a relentless struggle. A new era is dawning, one in which war is no longer a business tool, in which sovereignty is no longer a slogan, in which development is no longer locked in the hands of a few transnational corporations. The moment of reckoning has come. Either the world continues to be driven by calculated chaos, or humanity rises up, unites, and writes a new chapter, one where power no longer belongs to those who live by fear, but to those who dare to defend peace with truth. And that choice, for the first time in decades, is tilted toward those who dare to wake up.